On June 19, 1944, the sun rose over the Philippine Sea. The water stretched in every direction, a vast blue plain dotted with U.S. Navy ships. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing to strike. This would not be an ordinary day. It would become one of the most decisive battles of World War II in the Pacific. The location was near the Marianas Islands, a chain of islands that held great importance to both sides. The United States had begun its invasion of Saipan 3 days earlier. Saipan was more than just another island. If the U.S. captured it, American long-range B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. From there, they could strike Tokyo, Osaka, and other major cities. For Japan, losing Saipan would be a disaster. It would bring the war directly to their doorstep and threaten their ability to defend their empire. The Japanese response was swift. They gathered their remaining carrier forces and prepared a major attack to stop the U.S. advance. Their plan was bold: launch wave after wave of aircraft to destroy the American invasion fleet and drive the U.S. Navy back. The Japanese still had 9 carriers, though many of their ships were damaged and their aircraft were fewer than in the early years of the war. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the commander of the Japanese mobile fleet, hoped to surprise the Americans and win a decisive victory. On the American side, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet. He was cautious but determined. Under him, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher led Task Force 58, a powerful carrier group with 15 carriers and hundreds of aircraft. The U.S. Navy had grown stronger and more experienced with each battle since Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were well-trained, their ships modern and well-supplied. The U.S. also had a new advantage: radar. This technology allowed them to detect incoming Japanese planes long before they came into view. The morning of June 19th was calm. The sea was smooth, the sky clear. On American carriers, crews went about their routines. Pilots checked their aircraft, mechanics fueled and armed planes, and radar operators scanned their screens. Just after dawn, radar picked up the first signs of enemy movement. Large groups of Japanese aircraft were heading toward the American fleet. The alarm went up. Pilots rushed to their planes. Engines roared to life. One by one, Hellcats launched into the sky. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was the workhorse of the U.S. Navy. It was tough, fast, and heavily armed. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns could tear through enemy aircraft. The Hellcat had been designed to take on the Japanese Zero, which had dominated the skies early in the war. By mid-1944, the Hellcat had proven itself superior. Its armor protected pilots, and its firepower gave them confidence in battle. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached, the Hellcats were ready. Guided by radar controllers, they climbed high and positioned themselves to intercept. The Japanese pilots flew in tight formations, determined to break through. Many of them were young and poorly trained. Japan had lost many of its best pilots in earlier battles, and replacements were rushed through training. Their planes were still fast and maneuverable, but their tactics were outdated and predictable. The clash came suddenly. Hellcats dove from above, their guns blazing. Japanese bombers and fighters scattered. Some tried to fight back, others pressed on toward the American ships. The sky filled with smoke trails and burning wrecks. Pilots shouted over radios, calling out targets and warning each other of threats. The battle unfolded over a wide area, a chaotic dance of speed and firepower. Wave after wave came at the U.S. fleet. The Japanese launched 4 major strikes throughout the day. Each time, radar gave the Americans early warning. Hellcats intercepted the attackers far from the carriers, cutting them down before they could reach their targets. A few bombers slipped through and attacked, but U.S. anti-aircraft fire was deadly accurate. Only a handful of bombs and torpedoes struck American ships, causing minor damage. In return, the Japanese lost hundreds of planes. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of the lopsided results. U.S. pilots described it as easy hunting. By nightfall, nearly 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The U.S. lost only a small number of planes in combat, though more were lost due to accidents or running out of fuel. The human side of the battle was intense. On American carriers, Pilots returned from missions exhausted but exhilarated. Deck crews cheered as their planes landed. Some pilots never came back, their planes lost at sea. The tension was high, but morale soared as reports of victory spread through the fleet. For many sailors, it felt like the turning point they had been fighting toward for years. On the Japanese side, the mood was grim. Pilots who survived returned to carriers with horror in their eyes. Many of their friends were gone. Admiral Ozawa realized with growing despair that his fleet's air power was being wiped out. Without experienced pilots, his carriers were useless. By the end of June 19th, most of his air groups were gone. His carriers were now little more than floating targets. On June 20th, the U.S. struck back. Vice Admiral Mitcher ordered a massive late-day air attack on the retreating Japanese fleet. Hundreds of American planes took off in a daring strike at extreme range. As the sun set, they found the enemy. Bombs and torpedoes rained down on Japanese carriers and escort ships. 2 carriers were sunk, and others damaged. The U.S. pilots then faced a dangerous return flight in darkness, guided only by dim lights on their carriers. Many planes ran out of fuel and ditched in the sea, but the strike had succeeded. The result of these 2 days was decisive. Japan had lost almost all its trained naval aviators and over 600 aircraft. The U.S. had suffered minimal losses by comparison. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese hopes of stopping the American advance. Their carriers remained afloat, but they had no planes or pilots to fight with. It marked the end of Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. For the Americans, the victory opened the door to Saipan and the rest of the Marianas. With these islands in U.S. hands, B-29 bombers could now reach Japan's home islands. This battle was not just a clash of ships and planes. It was a pivotal moment in a larger campaign that would bring the war ever closer to Japan itself. The deck of a U.S. carrier in June 1944 was crowded with dark blue fighters lined up wingtip to wingtip. These were the Grumman F6F Hellcats, the most important fighter in the Pacific War by this stage. The Hellcat was built to survive. Its frame was thick and strong, designed to take heavy fire and keep flying. The cockpit was protected by armor plates, and self-sealing fuel tanks helped prevent explosions if bullets hit the plane. Each wing carried 3.50 caliber machine guns, for a total of 6. These guns could fire a wall of lead that shredded enemy aircraft in seconds. The Hellcat was fast, reaching speeds up to 380 miles per hour, and it climbed quickly, giving pilots the ability to gain altitude and strike from above. It was also easy to fly, forgiving of mistakes, and dependable in rough conditions at sea. The Hellcat existed for one reason: to defeat the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. At the start of the war, the Zero had been the king of the skies. It was light, fast, and incredibly agile. Early American fighters like the F4F Wildcat struggled to match it. U.S. pilots were forced to rely on tactics like the thatch weave just to survive. The Zero's dominance was clear in the opening battles at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. Grumman engineers studied every report and scrap of information about the Zero. When they got access to a captured plane, they examined it in detail. They built the Hellcat to counter every strength of the Zero. The Hellcat was heavier and less nimble, but it could absorb hits that would destroy a Zero. It dove faster, turned tight enough to fight effectively, and packed more firepower. It was the answer to years of hard lessons learned in combat. Technology was a key factor in this battle. By 1944, U.S. carriers carried advanced radar systems. Radar operators scanned the horizon day and night, detecting incoming aircraft long before they were visible. This early warning gave American pilots precious minutes to get airborne and climb into position. Fighter direction officers used radar to guide Hellcats toward enemy formations with precision. Over the radio, they gave headings, altitude instructions, and target data. This allowed the U.S. to fight with coordination that the Japanese could not match. Many Japanese pilots never saw their attackers until tracers were already streaking past their cockpits. Carrier operations on the American side were a study in discipline and efficiency. Planes cycled on and off the decks with speed. Crews worked below deck to refuel, rearm, and repair aircraft around the clock. When Japanese strikes approached, Hellcats scrambled in large groups, forming a protective barrier miles away from the carriers. If any enemy planes broke through, layers of anti-aircraft guns on the ships were ready to meet them. This system gave the U.S. fleet a powerful defensive shield and freed the carriers to launch their own strikes when opportunities arose. The Japanese also brought capable aircraft to the battle. The A6M0 was still their most common fighter, now updated to the A6M5 model. This version had some improvements like stronger wings and better dive performance, but it was still lightly built compared to the rugged Hellcat. The Japanese dive bomber force included the Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei, known to American forces as the Judy. It was fast and could strike accurately when it reached its target. Their torpedo bomber, the Nakajima B-6N Tenzin, nicknamed the Jill, carried heavy torpedoes meant to cripple U.S. carriers. In theory, these planes were dangerous weapons. In practice, they needed experienced pilots to make the most of their speed and striking power. Pilot quality had become Japan's greatest weakness. At the start of the war, Japanese aviators were among the best in the world. They had been trained in a strict, demanding system that produced elite combat pilots. Many had years of battle experience from China and the early Pacific campaigns. These men had led Japan to early victories. But war is relentless. The battles at Midway and in the Solomon Islands cost Japan thousands of skilled flyers. Unlike the U.S., which expanded its pilot training program and built a pipeline of replacements, Japan struggled to keep up. By 1944, many new Japanese pilots had only a few months of rush training before being sent into combat. They faced not only superior planes but also more experienced enemies who had survived multiple campaigns. This decline was visible in their tactics. Early in the war, Japanese formations moved with precision. Now they were often scattered and poorly coordinated. Young pilots made mistakes under pressure. Some broke formation too soon, others attacked too early or too late. These errors were deadly when facing Hellcats guided by radar and fighter direction control. American pilots attacked from altitude, using speed and surprise to their advantage. Often, they struck before the Japanese even realized they were in danger. The Americans had other advantages beyond technology and equipment. Their carrier crews were highly trained and well supplied. Every part of the system worked together, from the pilots to the deck crews to the radar operators. Radios were reliable, allowing pilots to communicate clearly during combat. Replacement planes and parts flowed steadily through the fleet's logistics chain. This meant that losses could be replaced quickly, keeping squadrons at full strength. The Japanese had no such support. Fuel shortages limited their training flights. Spare parts were scarce, and damaged planes often went unrepaired. Communication problems were common. Even when a pilot spotted the enemy, he might not be able to warn his squadron. As a result, Japanese attacks were often fragmented and easier for the Americans to defeat. Admiral Ozawa hoped his carriers could still deliver a knockout blow by massing what strength remained. He counted on surprise, speed, and the courage of his pilots. But the reality was harsh. The Americans could see him coming, intercept his strikes at long range, and keep launching fresh fighters as the battle went on. When the clash began over the Philippine Sea, it was not just a contest of planes but of entire systems. The side with better machines, better training, and better coordination held the advantage before the first shot was fired. The morning of June 19, 1944, was calm. The sea was flat, the sky clear, and the wind light. Aboard the Japanese carriers, deck crews worked with speed and urgency. Pilots climbed into their cockpits. Mechanics fueled and armed planes as officers shouted orders. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet was about to launch its strike. He knew this was his chance to hit the U.S. invasion fleet at Saipan. If his carriers could destroy enough American ships, they might halt the U.S. advance in the Marianas. Shortly after dawn, the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared off the decks. Bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters rose into the sky in tight formations. More waves followed. In total, more than 300 planes were sent out through the day, each group flying toward the American fleet spread across the Philippine Sea. Ozawa hoped that by sending repeated strikes, he could wear down the U.S. defenses and create an opening for a killing blow. Miles away, Aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, radar operators sat at their screens. Blips appeared in the distance, faint at first, then growing stronger. The alarm sounded across the fleet. Japanese planes were coming. Orders went out over the radio. Pilots raced to their Hellcats. Engines thundered as planes were rolled into position. One after another, they leapt from the carrier decks into the morning sky. The first wave of Hellcats climbed high, guided by fighter direction officers using radar. They moved to intercept the enemy before the Japanese even reached visual range. From their cockpits, American pilots could see the sun glinting off the wings of bombers far below. They rolled over and dove, guns ready. The clash was sudden and violent. Hellcats tore into the Japanese formation. Tracers streaked through the air. Japanese bombers scattered, breaking formation as they tried to dodge the attack. Fighters turned to fight, but the Hellcats had the advantage of altitude and surprise. Japanese losses mounted quickly. American pilots called out targets and warnings over their radios as they pressed the attack. Some Japanese planes broke through and continued toward the fleet. Anti-aircraft gunners aboard the carriers and escort ships opened fire. Black clouds of flak filled the sky. Bombers and torpedo planes exploded or plunged into the sea. A few managed to release their weapons, but most missed their marks. The damage to U.S. ships was light. A U.S. pilot later described the action in simple terms. It was like a turkey shoot at the county fair. The battle would be remembered by that phrase. The Americans had the upper hand in every way. Better planes, better tactics, and better information. The Japanese pilots flew bravely, but many were inexperienced and poorly trained. They were thrown into the fight against veteran U.S. squadrons and had little chance of success. Throughout the day, Ozawa launched more waves of aircraft. Each time, radar gave the Americans early warning. Each time, Hellcats met the attackers miles from the fleet. The results were the same. Japanese formations were cut to pieces before they could inflict serious damage. By mid-afternoon, the air over the Philippine Sea was littered with burning wreckage and oil slicks. Pilots on both sides struggled to find their way back to their carriers through smoke and haze. By the time the sun began to set, the scale of the defeat was clear. More than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in a single day. The Americans lost only a small number of planes in combat, though some were lost later to fuel shortages or landing accidents. The decks of the Japanese carriers were nearly empty. Without planes, they could no longer fight effectively. Ozawa had hoped to cripple the U.S. fleet, but instead, his own striking power had been broken. Aboard the U.S. carriers, pilots returned to their ships exhausted. Deck crews counted the planes that came back and the ones that did not. The mood was intense. There was relief at the scale of the victory, but also grief for those who had been lost. Reports came in from across the fleet, confirming what the pilots had seen. The Japanese attacks had been smashed before they could reach their targets. On June 20th, the Americans struck back. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered a late-day attack on the retreating Japanese fleet. It was a risky move. The distance was great, and there was little daylight left. Hundreds of U.S. planes launched in quick succession. They flew at extreme range, guided by scouts who had tracked the enemy's position. As the sun dropped low on the horizon, the American strike group found its targets. Japanese carriers and their escorts were spotted spread across the sea. Hellcats provided cover while dive bombers and torpedo planes went to work. Bombs and torpedoes ripped into the carriers. Flames and smoke rose as explosions tore through the decks. 2 Japanese carriers were sunk in the attack, and others were heavily damaged. The American pilots faced another challenge on the way home. Night was falling and many were low on fuel. Mitcher made a bold decision. He ordered the carriers to turn on their lights despite the risk of enemy submarines. The glowing decks guided the returning planes. Even so, many pilots had to ditch in the sea when they ran out of fuel before reaching the carriers. Rescue crews worked through the night to save as many as they could. The 2 days of fighting left the Japanese fleet shattered. Their air groups were gone, their carriers crippled. Admiral Ozawa's gamble had failed. Task Force 58, under Admiral Spruance and Vice Admiral Mitcher, had held firm and struck hard in return. The U.S. now controlled the skies over the Philippine Sea, clearing the way for the invasion of Saipan and the Marianas to continue without threat from Japanese carrier forces. The battle had changed the balance of power in the Pacific. As the last planes landed on the American carriers on the night of June 19th, the decks were lit by dim blue lights. Sailors rushed to guide the fighters in, waving signals and clearing space for the next incoming aircraft. The smell of fuel and gunpowder hung in the air. Pilots climbed out of their cockpits, some grinning, others silent, their faces streaked with sweat and salt. They had been in the air for hours, fighting wave after wave of enemy planes. Inside the ready rooms, pilots gathered around maps and mission boards. Some sipped coffee from metal cups, their hands still shaking from the fight. Others sat in silence, thinking about the friends who had not returned. Reports began to come in over the radios. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of Japanese planes destroyed, only a handful of American planes lost in combat. One pilot broke the silence with a single sentence that summed up the day. It was like a turkey shoot at the county fair. Laughter followed, not from humor but from disbelief. The pilots knew they had faced a skilled enemy in past battles. They remembered Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, where survival had been uncertain and losses had been high. Now they had dominated the skies with almost effortless precision. The difference was radar, training, and preparation. Radar operators had seen the enemy coming long before the Japanese could strike. Fighter direction officers had guided the Hellcats into perfect intercept positions. Pilots spoke of how smooth the coordination had been. One described it simply, "They told us where to go, we went there, and we found them every time." Years of planning and practice had paid off. The American system worked exactly as it was designed to, and the result was overwhelming. There was excitement aboard the carriers, but it was mixed with exhaustion. Deck crews who had been on duty since dawn slumped against bulkheads. Mechanics worked through the night to refuel and rearm planes for the next day. Medics treated wounded pilots and sailors. Messages were sent to families back home, notifying them of losses. For every moment of victory, there was also grief. The price was lower than in past battles, but it was still there. On the Japanese side, the atmosphere was very different. Pilots who managed to return to their carriers came back shaken and silent. Many had seen their friends shot down before their eyes. Some planes landed riddled with bullet holes, their pilots barely alive. Others never returned at all. As the day went on, the flight decks grew emptier. By nightfall, there were few planes left to launch. Survivors later described their feelings in diaries and interviews. One wrote of the confusion in the sky. His formation had been scattered by the first Hellcat attack, and he never saw his leader again. Another described diving toward an American carrier only to be surrounded by tracers, his bomber destroyed before it reached release range. These accounts spoke of bravery but also of despair. The Japanese pilots knew they were being sent against impossible odds. Below decks, the carrier crews listened to reports in stunned silence. They had prepared for a great victory. Instead, they watched as squadron after squadron failed to return. Men who had spent months maintaining planes and training pilots now faced the reality that their air groups were gone. Some wept openly as they saw the empty hangars. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa felt the weight of the defeat. From his flagship, he received a steady stream of grim updates. Entire squadrons wiped out, carriers damaged, pilots lost. He knew the battle was slipping away. His plan to strike a decisive blow had collapsed in a single day. Officers described him as calm on the surface but deeply troubled. This was not just a defeat of ships and planes. It was the destruction of Japan's remaining naval air power. Back in Japan, the news was carefully managed. Public reports spoke of heroic actions and temporary setbacks. The scale of the losses was hidden. Many families waited for word of their sons and husbands, only to receive vague messages weeks later. In private, some understood the truth. The carriers could not replace their lost pilots or planes. The hope of regaining control of the Pacific was fading. In the United States, newsreels played in theaters within days. Black and white footage showed carriers at sea, pilots climbing into their cockpits, and planes taking off in rapid succession. Narrators described the battle in simple, proud terms. Headlines called it a crushing victory. Families crowded into theaters to watch, cheering as they saw their Navy's strength on screen. For those aboard the American ships, the celebration was distant. They were already thinking about the next day's tasks. Some pilots wrote letters home, trying to explain what had happened without revealing details that were still secret. Others lay in their bunks, too tired to speak, the roar of engines and gunfire still echoing in their minds. On the evening of June 20th, when Mitcher's late strike returned in darkness, the human toll deepened. Pilots landed on glowing decks, some out of fuel, others ditching in the sea. Rescue crews worked frantically to pull men from the water. Even in victory, there was danger and loss. The battle left deep marks on both sides. For the Americans, it confirmed their belief in their training, technology, and teamwork. For the Japanese, it was a moment of shock and disbelief, a day when they realized that courage alone could not overcome a system that was now more advanced and better prepared. The human stories, written in logbooks and letters, told of triumph and tragedy, exhaustion and resolve, and the stark difference between two navies fighting for control of the Pacific. The battle in the Philippine Sea lasted 2 days, but its effects would shape the rest of the war in the Pacific. When the sun rose on June 21st, the Japanese carrier fleet was no longer the threat it had been just days earlier. Their air groups were gone, their best pilots dead or captured, and their ships damaged and scattered. The Japanese Navy had gambled everything on a decisive strike, and they had lost. In the early months of the war, Japan's carriers had been the heart of its power. At Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway, they had been used aggressively, striking far and fast. Their pilots were skilled and confident, their planes feared by American crews. That era ended in the waters off the Marianas. The destruction of hundreds of aircraft in one battle could not be undone. Japan did not have the resources to replace them, nor the time to train new pilots to the same standard as those who had been lost. The process of creating an experienced aviator took years, not months. As reports came in, the scale of the defeat shocked even Japanese commanders. Admiral Ozawa's carriers still floated, but they had no striking power left. A carrier without aircraft was little more than a target. The Japanese fleet that returned to port was hollow, a shell of its former self. Plans for future offensive operations were canceled. From this point forward, Japan could no longer take the fight to the Americans. The Imperial Navy was forced into a purely defensive role, trying to protect the shrinking borders of its empire. This shift in strategy was profound. Before the battle, Japanese leaders still believed they might win a major engagement and negotiate a favorable peace. After the battle, that hope faded. They could no longer challenge American control of the seas. U.S. fleets could move where they wished, supported by overwhelming air power. Japan's navy was reduced to escorting convoys, defending isolated islands, and waiting for the next blow to fall. The loss also exposed deeper problems within Japan's war effort. Pilot training had been cut short as the war dragged on. Fuel shortages limited practice flights. Replacement aircraft were built hastily and sometimes lacked quality control. These weaknesses had been hidden by the bravery of individual pilots, but after the Great Marianas battle, they were clear to everyone. The Japanese high command understood that no matter how many planes they built, they could not match the Americans in skill or numbers. The destruction of Japan's carrier air power also had immediate consequences for future battles. Just 4 months later, the two navies would meet again at Leyte Gulf, in the largest naval battle of the war. Without trained carrier pilots, Japan resorted to desperate tactics. They used their carriers as bait, sailing them into battle with only a handful of planes aboard. The goal was to lure the American fleet into a trap, while other Japanese forces attacked the invasion beaches. The plan failed, and Japan suffered an even greater defeat. From Leyte Gulf onward, Japanese carriers played no real role in the war. They were symbols of past glory, not tools of victory. The loss at the Philippine Sea had decided their fate long before the final shots were fired. For the United States, the victory opened new opportunities. The U.S. had entered the battle to protect its invasion of Saipan and the other islands in the Marianas. With the Japanese carrier threat removed, those invasions could continue without fear of massive air attacks from the sea. Within weeks, Saipan was firmly in American hands, followed by Tinian and Guam. These islands were more than stepping stones. They were the key to striking at Japan directly. From the airfields on Saipan and Tinian, the U.S. could base its newest weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was a long-range bomber designed to carry heavy loads over thousands of miles. From the Marianas, it could reach Tokyo and the other industrial centers of Japan's home islands. This changed the nature of the war. Before, the U.S. had to fight island by island, moving ever closer to Japan. Now, they could strike at the heart of Japan's war industry from afar. In November 1944, the first B-29 raids on Tokyo began. At first, they were high-altitude precision attacks on factories and military targets. As the campaign continued, tactics shifted to massive nighttime raids using incendiary bombs. The destruction was immense. Entire city blocks were reduced to ash. The ability to launch these attacks came directly from the victory in the Marianas. Without control of those islands, the B-29s would have had nowhere to land, refuel, or be repaired. The victory also gave the U.S. Navy greater freedom of movement. With Japan's carriers out of the picture, Task Force 58 and other American fleets could operate with little fear of being surprised. They could support ground forces, strike at enemy shipping, and attack Japan's remaining strongholds at will. This dominance allowed the U.S. to plan future campaigns, including the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, with confidence that their carriers would control the skies. For American leaders, the battle confirmed that their strategy was working. The focus on training, radar, logistics, and overwhelming force had paid off. Each part of the system supported the others. Pilots knew they would have the planes, fuel, and intelligence needed to win. Commanders knew they could rely on their crews to carry out complex operations under pressure. For Japanese leaders, the defeat brought difficult choices. Some urged a continued fight to the last man, hoping to delay the Americans and inflict heavy losses. Others began to consider more extreme tactics. By late 1944, Japan had begun using suicide attacks or kamikaze strikes as a way to make up for its lack of experienced pilots. These desperate measures were a direct result of the losses suffered at the Philippine Sea. The battle was not just a clash of ships and planes. It was a turning point in the Pacific War. When it ended, the balance of power was clear. Japan could no longer attack, only defend. The United States, now firmly in control of the seas and skies, could move forward at its own pace. The road to Tokyo was open, and the final phase of the war had begun. In the years after the battle, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot became more than just a name. It marked the moment when Japan's naval air power was broken beyond repair. The battle ended an era that had begun with the sudden shock of Pearl Harbor. At the start of the war, Japanese carriers had struck with speed and precision, showing the world a new form of naval warfare. By June 1944, that dominance was gone. In its place stood the U.S. Navy, whose carriers and planes now controlled the Pacific. The Hellcat became a symbol of this change. Before the war, few could imagine a single fighter doing so much to turn the tide. Pilots trusted the Hellcat because it brought them home even when riddled with holes. It was rugged and reliable, yet powerful enough to dominate the skies. In the Marianas battle, it proved itself beyond question. The F6F was not just a machine but a statement of how far American industry and design had come. Its success gave the U.S. Navy the confidence to keep pushing forward across the Pacific, knowing their fighters could meet and defeat anything Japan put in the air. In museums today, Hellcats are displayed with care, their dark blue paint gleaming under spotlights, a reminder of the pilots who flew them and the role they played in shaping victory. The battle also taught lessons that shaped the future of carrier warfare. Radar had been a game-changer. It allowed the U.S. to see the enemy first and strike on their own terms. Fighter direction officers, using radar data, learned how to guide planes into perfect attack positions. This coordination became the model for later naval operations. Modern carriers still rely on early warning systems and tight communication, ideas born out of those days in 1944. Training was another lesson. The Japanese had lost because they could not replace their veteran pilots. Their training programs were too short, too rushed. The Americans, by contrast, built a massive system to produce well-prepared aviators. Pilots rotated from combat back to training schools, where they passed on their knowledge to new recruits. This cycle created a steady flow of skilled men ready for the next battle. Modern navies follow this principle, understanding that experience and preparation matter as much as technology. Logistics played a quiet but vital role. The U.S. Navy's ability to keep its carriers supplied with planes, fuel, and ammunition gave it staying power. Forward bases, floating dry docks, and supply ships formed a network that stretched across the Pacific. Without this system, victories like the Marianas would not have been possible. Today, logistics remains central to carrier operations. The lessons learned in 1944 still guide how modern fleets plan their movements and sustain their forces. Historians see the battle as one of the most decisive in naval history. It was not just a clash of planes and ships, but a turning point in how wars would be fought at sea. Before World War II, battleships had been the symbol of naval strength. After the Marianas, it was clear that carriers were the new center of power. Aircraft, guided by radar and supported by complex networks of ships, had replaced the old ways of fighting. The speed of this change surprised even those who lived through it. In less than 3 years, Japan went from dominating the Pacific to losing its ability to even challenge the U.S. fleet. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot is also remembered for its human stories. Survivors on both sides kept journals and wrote letters that captured the experience in personal detail. American pilots wrote about the thrill of victory, the shock of seeing so many enemy planes fall, and the grief of losing friends in the same battle. Japanese pilots wrote about fear, confusion, and the crushing realization that they had been sent into a fight they could not win. These voices are preserved in museums and documentaries, where they give a face to the statistics. They remind viewers that behind every plane shot down was a pilot, a crew, and a family. In the United States, the memory of the battle was celebrated. Newsreels showed images of the fleet, the fighters, and the vast Pacific sky. The victory was presented as proof of progress and strength. In Japan, the memory was quieter and more somber. The scale of the loss was not fully shared with the public during the war. In later years, historians and veterans began to speak openly about what had happened, giving a fuller picture of the sacrifice and the mistakes that led to the disaster. Today, visitors to naval museums can walk the decks of preserved carriers and see the places where history was made. They can look up at the wings of a Hellcat and imagine the roar of engines and the smell of salt air. They can read the words of those who fought and understand how the battle shaped the final year of the war. The legacy of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot lives on, not only in books and films but in the lessons it taught about preparation, technology, and the changing face of naval power. It stands as a moment when the tide turned and the future of warfare became clear to all who witnessed it.